20 or more years now.
Yeah. 78.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I've been very remiss over the years and not accepted your invitation or had lots of excuses not to come, but this year we're here.
Therefore I come over to Whitstable each year.
Very many times, right.
Bob, you're originally from the seaside in Whitstable.
Yes.
That's where radio listening started?
Yeah, I still live in Tankerton, which is the provinces of Whitstable, and I, funnily enough, still look out at the fort in the Thames Estuary that I started broadcasting from, which is the Shivering Sands, Radio City. And it seems like a lifetime ago, and it almost is. It was 35 years ago that I started in broadcasting with Radio City. 1965, I was the tender age of 15.
Yeah, you were one of the youngest DJs ever on offshore radio.
I was. It was really by chance, and I know you're going to ask me this because you warned me, but Radio City was on the fort in the estuary, and I was fortuitous enough to live in Whitstable and used to buy my records from the record centre. And one day they decided they needed some tapes made, and I put the tapes together. And Reg Calvert thought I was good enough to go out, unbeknown to him of my tender years. And it happened more by luck than judgment.
There was also a Dutchman on the Radio City.
Yes, there was Martin Green, who was very, very competent. And again, I think he found his way there more by accident than luck. Yeah.
Never heard anything more?
No, and over the years you keep asking me for recordings of Martin, and they're few and far between. But a very likeable chap and very nice guy. Several others there who virtually have lost contact with were Dick Dixon, who's now down at Margate. There's Tony Pine, who, funnily enough, only lives a matter of yards from where I live. And I put together a documentary that we'll talk about perhaps in a minute, just last year. But most people that were in the radio station at that time have really moved on to other professions. They weren't really broadcasters. Unlike me, it set me up for life.
What did your parents think about you going out to a fort on the age of 15 years?
They thought, if I can say, I use a somewhat expletive, they thought I was bloody mad. Yeah, absolutely crazy.
They never told you you're not allowed to go?
No, I suppose I didn't realise how lucky I was. No, I went, and they were happy that I went, and wished me luck, and that's when I left home and carved a name for myself in the broadcast world.
And when you first, yes, this is a familiar question each time, the first time you went out to the fort.
Yeah. Everybody's so curious about the fort. I think that when you're very young, your impressions of life are not set, and so you're very flexible. And I'm an adaptable sort of person, and although there were some privations on the fort, it was, if you like, warm, comfortable, but very basic. And I think the crew that I first went out with, it was Paul Elvey, there was Dick Dixon and Chris Cross, and I didn't stay there very, very long. It was only a matter of a year. And in the school summer holidays, after all, you know, that was the way it was in those days. And I'd set my mind on making broadcasting my career, but it took a very long time for me in the era of the 60s to carve a name for myself. There just weren't the opportunities after the Pirates closed down.
Why did you choose for Radio City and not for one of the stations on the ships?
I would never have made it to anywhere else, Hans, you know that. I was absolutely blooming useless, still am. But the point is that that station was on my doorstep. I was available, I knew about music, I understood about the technical side and how to present, and I was able, if not competent, to do the job. And they were paying peanuts, you know, literally £1 here, £2 there. The best one ever got, even the top people there, was £10 a week.
Is it true that the story which goes that you had to take your own sheet with you?
No, absolute nonsense, no. There were sleeping bags there. They were ex-army camp beds, but that was it. And if you wanted to take a sheet, you could, but it wasn't a necessity.
Were there many things left from the wartime?
Yeah, the fort in itself inside was in fairly good order, and there was a lot of bits and pieces around left over from the war, but nothing really that you could take away from a memento. People had done that already.
Were there any problems with the customs when you had to go back to?
No, not really. We were in Whitstable. We were all known. It was operated from the record centre in Whitstable, which became, after David Such relinquished the control to his manager, who already owned it, incidentally. It was known what we were doing, so very little in the way of problems there, yeah.
What kind of person was Reg Calvert?
I don't remember Reg very well. He was 30 odd years old when I first met him, and he was, I can only say, and I wouldn't speak ill of the dead anyway, but he was a fairly volatile character from the Midlands. He wanted everything done now, if not sooner, and really chased everyone's tail at all times, always putting pressure on, and made some rudimentary and fundamental mistakes with the station. But crumbs, you know, the guy was fairly young in real terms. I was the baby, you know, I was the youngster in that, and looked on at him with admiration.
Was it a shock for you at such a young age that the director of the radio station was shot dead?
It was a shock, and it was quite a shock only last year learning who my paymasters were, which was the Cray twins. So yes, it was a shock. Yeah, yeah.
And Dorothy, I met her 10 years ago.
Yes.
And in my opinion, I found her a strange woman.
I never met Dorothy, so I can't comment on Dorothy. A strange woman. I've spoken to her a number of times on the phone, but that's all I can say.
Yeah. Dick Dixon.
Dick Dixon, he was a very competent guy. There was always this battle between him staying with Radio City and going off to work on Essex Radio BBMS, and in the end, of course, he did jump ship and go across to Essex, but it was only because he hit a brick wall with Reg Calvert and said, well, you know, either you're going to pay me another £2 a week or I'm going to go. And Reg said, well, go. So he did, literally.
And then did he have to, afterwards, said that it was much better on City than on Essex BBMS?
I think Essex, some of our chums were on Essex, and it was a much more basic station in every sense of the word. It was very much more hand to mouth than ever Radio City was. I think the luck with Radio City came not really, again, more by luck than judgment, was that the abilities of the engineers that came on board after Don Witt took a step back and Tony Pine took a step back, Ian West and Phil Perkins, they were excellent engineers, and they were able to turn out an incredibly good signal. And I have to say that Tony Pine was incidental in getting the big mast put up on the tower, which made it quite literally one of the strongest signals in offshore radio, which was a great benefit.
There have been many masts in offshore radio,
yeah,
on ships and on forts.
Sure.
I think the City was the only one which was hired.
It was rented at a colossal amount of about £1,000 a month, which was a lot of money in those days. And literally, as soon as the radio station closed down, the riggers came out and took that mast down. It was worth a lot of money. But it was rented, yeah.
Of course, very strange.
Yeah, very strange.
I think when listening back to those old program tapes of Radio City, the Auntie Mabel show, Auntie Mabel Hour, was far ahead than other programs.
We were doing a thing, there was the Kenny and Cash thing on Radio London, and I used to do a thing called the Fraser Le-Roi show. Leroy in those days, it's Le-Roi now because it sounds more, I don't know, adult perhaps. We've matured, haven't we? But the Auntie Mabel Hour was something Alan Clark I talk to occasionally, who's now with a television company, and he's completely ashamed of that period in his life. But it was fun at the time. Yeah, indeed.
Did you also do live appearances in those ballrooms which Reg also had?
It was really quite funny because I worked with a band that were called the Satans, and they became the Ways and Means. They were particularly popular in Germany, and they had a song or two called, I think, Sea of Faces and Little Old Lady from Pasadena that became hits. Dave Lee, the comedian, was the bass guitarist, who's still a very good friend of mine. And they sang some of the Radio City jingles that I still have the master tapes of, that you don't have yet.
It will come next time.
They will come in time, yeah. But it was obligatory to be seen out and about, and one of the favourite haunts was the King's Hall. The other place was Beatsbourne, and I used to quite often go out in tow with a band with what we didn't know would be called a discotheque. We literally plugged a couple of turntables into the band amps and played a song while they went and had a beer during their break. Yes, so that's that one.
When did you leave Radio City? Was it at the end or for...?
No, it was much sooner than that. I suppose I played about with it for a year before my parents decided that I should really look towards having a proper career.
After school days you went...
After school days I went into electronics and the light and learned about you know, what makes a diode work and a triode work and what have you, which was to become very useful later on, and to this day I still use that discipline in maintaining my own standards as my own station.
You did get an offer from BBC Radio Scotland.
Well, that was bizarre. When Radio City finished, I applied for Radio England, and Britain Radio, and I was clearly not good enough for that. And I carried on doing appearances and whatnot. And the only acceptance I got was from Radio Caroline in 1968. And literally, it was at the minute the ship got towed in, I was told to be at the dock, and literally the next day the thing had gone, which was a great sadness. And I'd applied like everybody in the world to Radio 1, and Radio 1 came back and said, there's a job for you doing what you're doing now, live appearances in Scotland. And I thought, no, I don't really fancy that, so I didn't take the opportunity, no. But I did get the offer, yeah.
Then it was back to basic, hospital radio.
Yeah, hospital radio. We set up a hospital radio network from Herne Bay, Canterbury and Margate, which was interesting. It was a collaboration. There was another chap that worked briefly with Radio London, the Big L. It was a bit of fun, but nothing more than that. Set it up and walked away from it, and did some training with people, but that was about it.
There's some difference with the hospital radio in England than in Holland. You have their own small transmitters now.
They do now, and more there's becoming low-powered transmitters in lots of the hospital networks around the country, yeah.
I remember it was in the 80s, BBC Radio Medway.
Yes, that was an interesting time. I was available at some stage to do some audio for one of their arts programmes, and I went off and interviewed some people, and they liked it. And Brian Faulkner, I believe it was, at the time, was going on leave, and they said, you're just the man to look after the afternoon programme for a month. And I found myself on air at 30 High Street in Chatham with the old Mark I rotary pop desk, which was absolutely brilliant, and I had a wonderful time there, yeah.
You started your own business back then?
Yeah, well, by that time, I'd started doing voiceovers, and alongside that, there was a period that I needed to make some money, and I set up doing some photography on the side. And one thing perhaps you don't recall is that I joined in 1978 a company called GC Avionics, using my electronics background, and I was working for the A7 project, which was the aircraft for the Vought Corporation, which was making head-up displays and video signal mixers for the Vietnam War. And then I progressed to the F-16 project, which was run out of actually Schiphol, and I used to come across every month to Holland to buy off the aircraft. And indeed I went to America, we're talking about 1980 now, and did some radio in America.
Radio Kent was the next stop in the early 80s.
Radio Kent was at the time that I started to get, we've missed a little bit, I got involved with Radio Caroline again around the 70s through the likes of Rob Eden, and he wanted tapes to put on during the evening, and I recorded in my shed, if you remember, very primitive tapes, and made some original LA jingles based on the Mike Hagler principle, and sent tapes out to the ship and were broadcast. But yes, indeed, by the early 80s I was working for the BBC again, and we did the first broadcast from their new building, yeah, which was a rock show, Kent Rocks, which was pretty well received, a bit of fun, something a bit different, yeah.
And you had also contacts with the people from Laser, something to do with the tendering?
Yeah, well, it was more than that, really. It was about 1984. Paul Rustling had the Punch Tavern in Whitstable, and he asked me to come down and see him. And Dave, the captain, lived across the road from Whitstable Harbour, who was the captain of the ship, as did Blake Williams and Rick Harris. And I went to see them. And Paul Rustling asked me to go to his pub and see him and his wife, and I had a chat. And he asked me whether I would actually program Laser for them from the ship, and I decided, and looking at the in from the outside, was that it was really a hiding to nothing, and I didn't take that opportunity. Yeah, but we did do quite a lot of supplying of both Caroline and Laser, and particularly through the Eurosiege, which was of great importance to them and us, and we did it with almost the blessing of the local customs, and we did it from a vessel called the Henrietta, which came out of Whitstable Harbour with a guy called Graham, Captain Graham, who's a lifelong friend of mine. We were at school together from the age of 5 years, and he's still on the scene now.
The late 80s, early 90s?
Late 80s and early 90s was an interesting time. With Caroline, we put the last generator on board from Whitstable just before the raid. We'd kept the thing going. It was very distressing seeing how conditions were going on the ship. I never once did a live programme from the Ross, but I did record, I think John Tyler or someone recorded me on the ship doing an overdrive programme, and for the fun of it decided they put it on at the same time as I was presenting my BBC show, which was fun. But during the late 80s and 90s, I started looking at the licenses that were coming up for the future. And we missed a period again where I was involved in the original Invicta license in '83, but it wasn't of significance. But the late 80s, of course, that saw a revolution in the way the broadcasting authorities operated in the UK and the feasibility, if you like, of releasing some frequencies for use for a smaller type radio station. And I was incidental in helping clear those frequencies and indeed go for those licenses.
During the Invicta period, you worked also with Andy Archer?
Yeah, I worked with Invicta from '88, and that went through to '93, when by that period of time we'd started quite considerable work on other projects, and I'd worked with Andy Archer, Roger Day, several other people that had links with Caroline, either tendering or in a production sense. Yeah. And it was quite a fascinating story. It's quite nice to put it on record that there was a fight between what Roger Day wanted and what Andy Archer wanted, and they were conversely different things. And one would go into the studio and start one's program, only to find that one or the other of them came down, tore up your script, threw your copy away, and told you to play a completely different sort of music. So it wasn't without its incidents at that time. And I believe you came over to see us during that period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After leaving Invicta, you were heavily involved in getting a license for the Roger.
Yeah, it was funny really, because, and I thank the man that did it. I was actually, I'm quite happy to say this, I was sacked from Invicta, almost sacked. I walked out as it happened, because I'd already had a chap in and he was making voiceovers for the new stations. And they decided, the new company that had taken over our Invicta radio, that my services weren't required. So I decided, in advance of them sacking me a week later, I'd go now, which left them in a little quandary. But we worked pretty hard and fast for there were several licenses going. There was TLR in Thanet, there was EKR from Canterbury, which became CTFM, and Medway, which was the biggest of all of them, and put all the money that I'd earned during that period into gaining a license for Medway, which we won, and deservedly so, I have to say.
How long is the station on the air now?
3 years now.
Yeah. It's going well?
It's going well. We've made an agreement with the Daily Mail Group. They have a management agreement with us. We see that as being positive, progressive. The station can grow along with our staff. It enables me to look at my own career more closely, and should the opportunities within the UKRD radio group be right for me, recognising I'm no longer a young man, I'll stay with them. But if it looks as though I'm not quite what they want and it's not quite what I want to do, it opens up other opportunities for me in the future, which I hope very much includes the continuation and success that we've strived for with Radio Caroline, which has always been the one love of my life.
Yeah. You do some other things?
I do, yeah, I do quite a lot of other things really. I still do commercial production on demand. I'm heard on Heart and Virgin and Radio Clyde and radio stations around the world. But I also get involved with a company in Malta and help program Calypso 102. And in fact, as you know, I've just come back for doing 10 days, doing the drive time show and sorting out some of the problems we have there. So I do that as well, yeah.
And still the other jock who works on the Voice of Peace is still...
we have two people over there at the moment. Steve Joy, who worked for me, was on the Voice of Peace, and shortly he was with Caroline. And just visiting for a few days is Dave Asher, who was on the Voice of Peace. He's over in Malta at the moment. The other project, of course, that goes hand along in glove with what we do with Caroline is Radio North Sea International, which we did for the first time.
Yeah, we saw you this morning on the video.
I feel very sorry for you. And we're bringing that back this year. I wasn't going to get involved again, but I was asked to, so weakness took over and I said yes. And Sandra, my wife, said, you can go.
And you will be working again together with Andy Archer.
Andy Archer's coming down, apparently very much looking forward to seeing me. We'll see. He can buy the first round of beers.
Okay, Bob, thank you so much for coming over here.
Thank you very much.
And we see each other later this year.
Thank you so much. Okay. Nice to see you again, Hans. Okay. God bless you.